In a damning indictment of the US government's lack of care for journalists who are its own citizens, it's now been roughly 2 weeks since the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and the injuring of her colleague in an area of the West Bank known as Jenin refugee camp.
We're bringing you the news that a journalist for Al Jazeera Network, our correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh, has been shot in the face and has died shortly afterwards.
When the killing of this clearly marked journalist wearing a press vest occurred, the United States government responded by saying that it trusted the Israeli authorities to carry out a thorough investigation, and now it's clear that Israel has no intention of even investigating itself. So in order to get proper context to find out why this is so incredibly outrageous, we have to go back to the day of the killing itself. When Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, the original reports which came out of the scene were from journalists who witnessed the events transpire themselves. They all said, without exception, that Israel was the one who carried out this killing.
We made ourselves clear to the army and the passers-by, indicating that we are the press. Then within seconds there was the first shot. I told them that we are being targeted. I turned and found Shireen on the ground.
Yet the Foreign Ministry of Israel quickly went into action by publishing a video of Palestinian gunmen firing, claiming that these gunmen possibly could have killed Shireen, and hence when Western media reported on this story, instantly there was a debate as to who killed Shireen, even though this evidence did not hold up, as the top Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem did an investigative piece that very same day proving without a reasonable doubt there is no possibility that those gunmen were able to have killed Shireen from that location. It would have been impossible.
The Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem showed that Israeli claims that there was gunfire from Palestinians, in fact, related to some place that was hundreds of meters away.
Despite this disinformation being quickly debunked, Israeli Prime Minister and other officials within the Israeli government continue to assert that Palestinians are likely responsible for the killing of Shireen, most likely in order to cover up for the fact that their soldiers did this. When this Israeli argument didn't hold up, we then heard another excuse come out, and that was that the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah didn't want to do a joint investigation with Israel, therefore admitting that Palestinians were somehow responsible. But that really just wasn't the case. Israel did offer a joint investigation publicly with the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority rejected, stating that it was transferring the case to the International Criminal Court to deal with because it didn't see it fit for Israel to investigate a crime that it believed Israel was responsible for.
The Palestinian authorities have called for the International Criminal Court to launch an investigation, but Israel doesn't recognize the ICC as a legitimate authority.
Despite the quickly debunkable disinformation that was being disseminated by the Israeli government, the US State Department stated nonetheless that same day that they trusted Israel to carry out a thorough investigation, and therefore, because Israel can be depended upon to investigate itself and its own soldiers, there was no need for an investigation internationally or on any larger level. But as we can see from past examples, this excuse really does not hold up. The last time Israel actually punished one of its soldiers for killing a Palestinian was back in the case of Elor Azaria, who killed a Palestinian man in cold blood in 2016. Now, there was a video of the entire incident which made it impossible to lie about or distort the truth behind what really happened. Elor Azaria, the Israeli soldier who was responsible for shooting in the head a Palestinian man who was laying on the ground unconscious, was eventually sentenced to 18 months imprisonment, but many Israelis were outraged by the fact that one of their soldiers could be punished in this way for this sort of crime, and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Elor Azaria and gave him a hero's welcome when he came out of prison.
Elor Azaria, also known as the Hebron shooter, was released from prison today after serving 9 months after being convicted for manslaughter.
You can also pull up the comparison between the last high-profile killing of a Palestinian journalist by the Israeli military. This was back in 2018 when the Israeli military killed Yasser Murtaja in the Gaza Strip when he was covering demonstrations.
Despite the fact that the word press was emblazoned on the front of that vest. Palestinian journalist Yasser Murtaja was shot by Israeli forces while covering the mass protests in Gaza.
Now, everyone who conducted independent investigations, every eyewitness says that he was killed and executed by Israeli snipers. Israel, however, after being urged to investigate this killing, not only did it not investigate the killing, but members of the Israeli Knesset and the Israeli government itself attempted to paint Yasser as a terrorist and claim wrongfully that he was operating a drone above the heads of Israeli soldiers, and somehow that made it fine for Israeli snipers to shoot him and kill him. Putting that aside now, we can cross over to the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, which took place in Jerusalem, where Israeli forces violently assaulted mourners at the funeral, even attacking pallbearers, making them basically drop the casket of Shireen Abu Akleh onto the ground almost. Not only this, but in order to cover up for their actions, which were widely condemned around the world, the Israeli police produced a video which seemed to have been doctored to make Palestinians look like they were throwing bottles and stones at Israeli forces, thus provoking them to attack the funeral. Not that this would make it alright anyway, but the Israeli police doctoring a video of the event in order to make themselves seem like victims doesn't exactly point to the fact that Israel is able to investigate its own forces. A few days after this, Israel then stated that it wouldn't investigate the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh altogether. They provided the justification that this would cause too much upheaval in Israeli society if soldiers were put under investigation in this way.
In this current political climate, is simply untenable for the Israelis. They cannot investigate an serving Israeli army soldier.
You thought it couldn't get any worse? A European delegation traveling to Jerusalem, which sought to discuss what happened in the case of Shireen, were blocked from doing so. Furthermore, then, the day after that, Israel announced that not only will it not investigate this case, with some calls from inside the establishment to investigate it, but that even in the event that an Israeli soldier was responsible, they couldn't be found guilty of any criminal misconduct because of the fact that they were operating in essentially a war zone. Does this sound to you like a country which is capable of investigating its own soldiers? Well, if it doesn't, then you have to ask yourself the question, does the US government really care about its own citizens, specifically its own journalists?